Good morning, and welcome to this event on securing America's supply chains. To everyone tuning in, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Megan Lambert, and I'm an Associate Fellow on the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. We're here today to talk about America's supply chains and the ways in which the US government or private industry might work to bolster supply chain resilience and security. Earlier this year, my CNAS colleagues and I published a report that explored some of the supply chain challenges the US faces. Our report offered a variety of recommendations to policymakers, including the need to craft a supply chain strategy and the need for greater collaboration with like-minded countries. The breadth of the supply chain challenge is vast, and it will only get more complicated as time goes on. The United States must do what it can now to ensure its supply chains are resilient enough to withstand upheaval, geopolitical conflict, or natural disaster. We have a number of leading thinkers joining us today to discuss this challenge, and I want to encourage all of you tuning in to join in the conversation. You can ask questions using the chat function at cnas.org/live or by using the hashtag CNAS2022 on Twitter. And with that, we'll get started. I'm thrilled to introduce our keynote speaker, Congresswoman Chrissy Houlihan. Congresswoman Houlihan has represented Pennsylvania's 6th Congressional District since 2018, the first woman to ever represent that district. Representative Houlihan has spent her entire career in service. She's an Air Force veteran, an engineer, an entrepreneur, and an educator. Representative Houlihan, thanks so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And just making sure that you can hear me okay before I begin.
Perfect.
Perfect. It's so nice to be with you guys, and good morning, everyone. As was just mentioned, my name is Chrissy Houlihan, and I'm really excited to be here today. And I have a little bit of prepared remarks before we begin what I think is a moderated Q&A. I'd really very much like to thank the Center for a New American Security for inviting me to speak with you all today. Clearly, the work that you're all doing is at the forefront of our nation's foreign policy and, of course, national security as well. So in the 5 minutes that I have, I'd like to cover a few things, 3 things in particular. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my background and why I'm sitting here on your screen talking to you, and about why I work on our supply chain management issues in Congress and why it's making such a big difference for Pennsylvanians and Americans. Second, I want to talk about your report that you just mentioned, appropriately named The Tangled Web We Wove, Rebalancing America's Supply Chains. And third, and lastly, I want to make sure that we can talk a little bit about what I'm doing in Congress and what Congress is doing as a whole on these issues and the steps that we hope are ahead. So first, a little bit about Pennsylvania's 6th Congressional District. It's just outside of Philadelphia. In our community, I like to brag a lot about our community. We are super hardworking, really kind people who want to do what's best, not just for our family and for our neighbors, but of course also for future generations. And I know that sounds pretty corny, but that's really how I talk about our part of Pennsylvania with my colleagues down in DC, no matter where my colleagues are from. I'm really proud to represent this community, because not every community is really so thoughtful and forward-thinking and practical. Important for you to know about my community, we are a purple place. We are roughly speaking 40% Democrat, 40% Republican, and 20% independent, which is quite unusual for congressional districts. And we value policies over politics. And I think that's also important for an organization such as yours. So here in our community, data and facts very much guide our decisions, and they help us best serve the public. So to that end, just yesterday, I had an in-person town hall in my community, and we covered in detail the complexity of supply chain issues, which came up in our question and answer session. And I asked the audience to raise their hands and speculate how many Americans they thought, or members of the audience, or frankly, members of Congress, knew what a supply chain was just a few short years ago. And I think the answer was very few. Very few people knew what a supply chain was before our pandemic struck, and very few members of Congress did as well. And I told the audience and reminded them that, in fact, I think I'm one of the very few people in Congress who actually knew what a supply chain was before the pandemic hit, because that is indeed what my kind of engineering is about. I'm an industrial engineer. My graduate work and thesis from MIT is actually in supply chain management in the airframe industry in particular. And so this has been something that I've spent my career doing, whether when I was the chief operating officer of a basketball apparel and footwear company, or the president of a company that managed educational outreach around our country. We very much were focused on supply chains and inventory issues, and that has been my job until joining Congress. But right now, what we're seeing and what we all now know is that what happens when a supply chain is fractured will end up being something that replicates and has repercussions across the country. And it has now become a discussion topic at kitchen tables about supply chains. So while my constituents come from very different backgrounds, whether they're first responders or teachers or small business owners, everyone in the room yesterday also now understands that supply chain issues are not a web that we can seriously untangle overnight with one piece of legislation or one strike of the pen at the president's desk. So the fact is that our economy is very, very resilient, but we have, as you all know, and is why this report was, I'm certain, written, enormous pressures that are remaining on us, whether it's on the economy in particular or with supply chain specifically. While our country has shown remarkable resilience in the face of the ongoing pandemic, the shortages that we've experienced in critical medical supplies, the shortages that we're experiencing in semiconductors, or just other sorts of regular goods and materials and services that have dramatically shrunk in the pandemic and in the Ukraine war situation as well. We now know what the vulnerabilities are of our supply chains, and also, as you mentioned, Megan, earlier, those of our allies and our partners, and the reliance that we have on that global supply chain as a whole. We also acutely know specifically that the Chinese production of crucial medical items or pharmaceutical ingredients or chips or various manufacturing items is really something that we need to understand, and we need to understand that it is a dangerous over-reliance on these products from this particular part of the world. And it's critical to our national health, to our national economy, and to, frankly, our national security as well. So we know that these stressors exposed the modern supply chain's fragility as what it was. It has necessitated a rethink and a redesign of what supply chain networks should look like into the future to make sure that we do have an increase in resilience and an increase in agility and a decrease in dependence on others. So that's where my second part comes in, which is I wanted to reflect really briefly on the report that you mentioned earlier. There were 3 pillars of your report, and I believe them to be really incredibly important, salient, and relevant to this conversation right now. The first part of your report was noting that the pendulum of globalization is swinging and has swung too far left, and it's left us very vulnerable. And I very much agree with that assessment. The second assessment in your report was encouraging American policymakers, and I guess I would put myself among them, to balance domestic manufacturing with sourcing from trusted partners, which is to say we shouldn't be exclusively focused on onshoring everything, but rather reshoring, nearshoring, peershoring, as well as onshoring. And we can talk about that later. And I agree with that assessment as well. And the third part of the report reminded us all that the best options that we always have, frankly, may not be the least expensive options. And again, I agree. And again, when we think about the heritage and history of supply chains in this nation over the last, let's call it 30 or 40 years, it has very much been a race to the bottom in terms of price. And we may need to rethink that in the future. So in my capacity in serving both at the Air Force and also as an entrepreneur, it was my job to work with manufacturers and suppliers and logistical entities to make sure that our goods and equipment were arriving when and where they were needed. And as someone with a background in supply chain management, my experiences have turned into legislative support and actions. I'm really, really glad to be in Congress. I'm a sophomore now, so I'm in my 3rd year. And I serve on the Armed Services and the Foreign Affairs and the Small Business Committees. Very, very deliberately have coupled or thrupled those things together because I think that they are all very much interrelated in terms of the issues that we're talking about right now. Where we have influence in terms of national security on our supply chain issues, where it is, of course, influenced by the rest of the globe on foreign affairs. I serve on the Asia subcommittee. And finally, of course, through small businesses. And if we learned anything about supply chains and about our reliance on each other, we learned that small businesses are very much the backbone of our success in this country and in the global economy. So now for my third topic, which is what's happening in Congress. I very much always engage in bipartisan discourse in deliberations on with both sides of the aisle, and of course bicamerally as well. We're all looking for solutions to all of the issues that are pressing on us. One example is that I was able to participate in something that was called the Defense Critical Supply Chain Task Force. In that task force, we addressed our dependency, of course, on foreign resources for things like rare earth elements or critical minerals. As we all probably know, or most of us do, these are vital resources that are critical to our nation's security, to our defense, and of course to our industrial backbone as well. So this committee, this special committee, focused on that. We also focused our work on maintaining a strong defense by making sure that our domestic supply of resources, such as medication for our military service members, were strong as well. So in Congress, I've introduced something bicamerally and bipartisanly that's called the Strengthening Supply Chains for Service Members and Security Act, which is HR 6374, for those of us who want to look that up. This piece of legislation was introduced to protect pharmaceutical supply chains that service members, those in uniform, depend on. And I'm really delighted to report that this particular measure was recently introduced in the House version of the National Defense Authorization Act. And I'm very, very hopeful that it will also be included in the Senate version and in the final version of the NDAA. And so I'll remain committed to making sure that we're looking specifically at this and other ways to lessen our dependence on foreign materials in defense and national security sectors as well. Among other provisions that I've included in that NDAA that just passed last week is a reduction in the reliance on China for essential rare earth minerals, which we've talked a little bit about before. All of my initiatives have enjoyed bipartisan support, which is very important to me. And it also demonstrates that my colleagues in Congress understand that efficiency at the price of resilience cannot be the main criterion around which our supply chains are constructed. And rare earth and critical minerals are a really good example of that, case study of that. So while our initiatives won't necessarily address all of our supply chain problems overnight, these are very critical steps in the right directions. So finally, I'll conclude with some of the next steps from here. I'm here today to recognize the very hard work that you all do to put together this report. It obviously shows how critical it is to recalibrate our supply networks for the long haul and to not just resort on problematic pre-pandemic methods. There's probably a bunch of PhD theses to be had about things like that I learned in school, like just-in-time inventory and those sorts of things. Addressing this decrease necessitates showcasing and understanding that the finest alternatives may not necessarily be the least expensive. And in planning for the next catastrophe, which might be just around the corner, it's important to understand why a country with so much wealth, like the United States has, was delayed in responding to, and in many cases, unable to respond to the fundamental demands that keep our citizens safe as possible. So this realization and this understanding will help us and enable us to endure the next global crisis, whatever it is, with, I hope, far less disruption than this one has. I also serve as a conferee, which is somebody who sits between the House and the Senate with legislation to help reconcile that legislation to get it to be passed to the president's desk for signature. And I'm sitting as a conferee on something called the America Competes Act, or the USICA Act, depending on which side of the House or Senate you are on. I'm looking forward to seeing that piece of legislation passed as well. That will be something that I hope will happen in the very near future, because if it doesn't happen in the near future, it may not happen at all. But this will be something that will very much focus on bringing better and more competitive manufacturing back to our nation and to our peers, and research and development as well. Money for that to make sure that we're priming the pump for the future of what our technologies will look like. With that, I will conclude by saying once again, thank you for having me here. Really grateful to have a conversation about these really important issues, and I will turn it back over to our hosts.
Representative Houlihan, thank you so much for those remarks. It's fascinating to hear how your background has so prepared you for this moment. That's really interesting to hear. And thank you for raising our report that we published earlier this year. We could go in a lot of different directions, but you mentioned about some of the town hall meetings that you've had, and obviously supply chain vulnerabilities have touched each and every American in some way or another. In your perspective, what are the key vulnerabilities impacting U.S. supply chains now? And what do you think are like the one or two things the U.S. government is doing to address them that you'd want to highlight?
Sure. We see this vulnerability everywhere. And one of the things we are doing, I mentioned the Competes Act. That really is a very, very serious, could be historic piece of legislation if we're able to get that across the finish line. And I have great hope that we will, because this is one of those pieces of legislation that recognizes kind of where all of the let's call it the 80-20 rule. 80% of our vulnerabilities are in certain industries and in certain manufacturing technologies, and the Competes Act is focused on that. It is also focused on making sure that we are protecting patents, which is another vulnerability, focused on making sure that we have resources to be able to develop the next generation of things that we will be uniquely known for, because that is one of our strengths as Americans, is innovation and entrepreneurism. So I'm really excited about that piece of legislation. But what I would also say that, we need to be focused on, and what we can also be doing more on in Congress, is things like cyber attacks or cyber security, cyber vulnerabilities. Although cyber attacks, cyber security, and cyber vulnerabilities can come from any direction. They can come from a nation state or a state, or it can come from, rogue actors. But these are all pretty significant vulnerabilities to our supply chains. When you think about things like access to clean water or energy, or access to food, those are things that can be, frankly, vulnerable to cyber attacks. Businesses can be vulnerable to cyber attacks. And since we are a web or a nation of smaller businesses, those attacks are kind of pretty much can be aimed at the weakest link. And those weakest links tend to be some of our smaller business entities, because they don't have the wherewithal to protect themselves from those vulnerabilities. And so I think that it's really important in the work of the Small Business Committee to focus on making sure that we're shoring up our smallest businesses from cyber vulnerabilities and cyber attacks. And that is something that I'm focused on in Congress. We also need to kind of understand kind of the full span of kind of the largest of our prime contracts, to use a phrase from from DoD, all the way down to our smallest subcontractors and second, third, and fourth tier suppliers. That's something that I think that we all didn't appreciate really until the pandemic as well. When I used to work in the apparel and footwear industry, I mentioned to you, and when one little piece like a grommet or an eyelet for a shoe isn't available, you don't have a shoe. And so it doesn't matter if you've got everything else humming along. If you don't have every last one of those things addressed with a reliable source, you're in trouble. So I think that's another thing that we need to be focused on as well.
Thank you, Congresswoman. You mentioned this earlier, but in the news, we've heard so much about the semiconductor supply chain, and similar to shoe wear, there's so many necessary components and materials that go into a semiconductor chip. And a lot of these materials and supplies exist outside of the United States. In your perspective, in what ways could the U.S. be collaborating more closely with its allies in this particular space?
Sure. I actually was able to go on what's called a CODEL, or Congressional delegation, a trip overseas with my chairman of the Armed Services Committee recently. And we traveled to Australia and we traveled to India. I hope to travel with him as well to Japan, as well as to Indonesia, for exactly this conversation, which is we need to obviously reshore and bring back quite a lot of the things that are our most vulnerable industries, and silicon chip manufacturing is part of that. But we also need to think about the pieces and parts that go into that. And in some cases, as we've talked earlier, things like critical minerals or rare earth materials, they exist here in this nation, and we can mine them here in this nation. But the reality is that this nation doesn't necessarily have the appetite to process them here right now. So we need to be working with people in places like Australia, which is one of our strongest allies, that has an abundance of many of these minerals or rare earths, and also has the space and capacity to be able to process them. And so that's kind of a good example of like finding your allies, finding India is another example in different, for different purposes, to make sure that you're not just sort of separating yourself from reliance on China in particular, but that you're working to find ways to make it most effective and efficient to bring it either home or near shore, which would talk about places that are physically proximate to us, or peer shore, which would talk about places where we have relationships with our allies. So we certainly need to be working on developing our own domestic manufacturing capabilities. We have a company here in my district called Vishay Technologies, which is a huge chip manufacturer. They are very much interested in bringing back a lot of the work that they do, which they frankly do overseas right now. But that requires quite a lot of laying out of the capabilities and workforce to be able to do that, as well as the pieces and parts. And you did bring up a really good point, which is we talk about chips like they're a single product. The number of SKUs that we're talking about, the number of purposes that they have is astronomical as well. So it's not quite as easy as it seems.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Well, I think we have time for one more question, but I would be curious to hear, as we move into, perhaps the next phase of the pandemic, what you see as the big challenges ahead in the coming months for U.S. supply chains.
So I think that it's good that you brought that up, because I think what's important for all of us to recognize is, or at least in my mind, it's important for all of us to recognize is we still are not out of this pandemic. While the numbers definitely appear to be trending in what I would consider to be the right direction, I hope we all do. There's obviously always a possibility that we could see another variant this fall or winter, or some sort of a spike in some other part of the country, of the planet, that would affect further the supply chains that we already are experiencing as being vulnerable. And so it could be that we are not necessarily out of the woods in this way. So I would say that's my first caution. My second thing that we should anticipate or expect is Russia's invasion of Ukraine really is very significant. And it did not, of course, help with these issues of supply chain vulnerability on things like food and fertilizer in particular, and of course, access to energy sources as well. So that also is something that I think we should be aware of and looking out for. I know that President Biden and the G7 are all talking right now about that very issue and committing quite a lot of resources to that issue, particularly of food and food scarcity. But I think that we really need to do everything we can to bring that war in Ukraine to an end, and to an end in Ukraine's favor. And it has everything to do with this issue of inflation and price spikes and all of the kinds of things we feel are kitchen table issues are really very much global issues. So whether it's the pandemic or the invasion of Ukraine, or frankly what could happen on the other side in the Indo-PACOM theater of China and Taiwan, those are all things we should keep our eyes on.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Well, thank you so much for your time and for your candor. I wish we had another hour, but unfortunately we have to move on to the next portion of our session. But thank you again so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure. I'll see you all later, and thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Congresswoman. Well, I'm excited to introduce and turn things over to my CNAS colleague, Alexandra Seymour, for the portion of our session. Alexandra?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Megan, and thank you for hosting that great conversation with Representative Houlihan. Big thanks to her for joining us. As Megan said, my name is Alexandra Seymour. I'm an associate fellow on the Technology and National Security program here at CNAS. And I'm really looking forward to continuing the conversation with some exceptional panelists who are going to continue talking about securing America's supply chains. This is all built on a report that we released back in March called The Tangled Web We Wove. So today I have three panelists who are joining us here. And also for all of you, please remember that you can join the conversation as well. You can either enter your questions into the chat box, or you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag CNAS2022. So For now, I will move on to introduce my panelists who bring a range of government and industry experiences to this conversation. First, I have Tara Murphy Doherty. She is the CEO of Gavini. Prior to her role as CEO, she served in several leadership positions, including as Gavini's President of National Security, as Chief of Staff for Global Strategic Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and she also served at Palantir Technologies. Next, I have Dr. Susan Helper. She is a senior economist on the Council of Economic Advisors at the White House and a professor of economics at Case Western University, where she focuses on the globalization of supply chains and how to revitalize U.S. manufacturing. She served in the government previously as well at the U.S. Department of Commerce and at the White House CEA. And finally, I have Carrie Wibben, who is the president of Government Solutions at Exiger. She has more than 2 decades of government experience, including as the Deputy Director of the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, as well as has served in the Executive Office of the President, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and she's also served in the military. So thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate your time and are looking forward to hearing all that you have to share. So I want to jump right in and start actually with something that we had within our report. We made a number of recommendations when we laid out this report, and one of them was about how we need to create a supply chain strategy. That this is something the White House should do with the support of Congress. I'm curious, and I'd like to turn to you first, Dr. Helper, about what you all think the key pillars should be in a strategy that we would create.
Wow, that's a great question. I think, where should I start? I think resilience and friendshoring. I mean, I guess we have a number of overarching goals as an administration, and the supply chain strategy touches each of them. So those are resilience, climate, equitable growth, basically an economy where everybody can see themselves, where there are good jobs, and the supply chain strategy then needs to deal with all of those things. And so domestic production is actually a key thing here, in that it dramatically improves resilience by reducing lead time. I guess I also, as Representative Houlihan said, you don't need to make 100% of everything here, but we do need to bring more things back. That's a complicated process. There's been some discussion about diversification of supply chains, and I think these supply chains are so concentrated in so many areas. I'm not sure the figure was given. 92% of advanced semiconductors come from Taiwan. 97% of ingots and wafers for solar panels come from China. 80% of advanced pharmaceutical ingredients come from some combination of China and India, as best we can tell. So diversifying our supply chain and reshoring are actually consistent strategies. I think, in line with your recommendations, we need a whole lot more information about supply chains. And so I guess maybe one thing I can lay out as a framework that we have for sort of thinking about resilience specifically. And there's kind of 3 elements to resilience, I think. One is visibility. And this gets to your recommendations around just understanding things better. And as the representative said, most people who weren't supply chain geeks didn't understand the number of layers in these supply chains, how complicated they are. I don't think that's inevitable. I actually think that traceability is a good both for business and for enforcing things like our human rights obligations, et cetera. But anyway, visibility is a key aspect, and we need to do a lot more, and government has a key role there. A second, you might call redundancy. These are a number of strategies around making sure there's lots of suppliers, that there's inventory, stockpiles, et cetera. And that's necessary in some cases, but it's expensive and it has real downsides. So particularly with inventory, it can become obsolete. You can hold inventory of the wrong thing. And so in general, a better strategy is agility, where you have companies that can quickly pivot to make whatever is needed. So, when material is missing, they can make something else. We have a tenfold increase in demand for PPE. We can have companies that step in. And so the solutions here are a combination. There's some technology solutions, so additive manufacturing or 3D printing. Also, a lot of our initiatives around training might not seem to have anything to do with supply chains, but if you can create workers that are deeply trained to understand the principles behind what they're doing, they can solve problems that come up quickly. So I think each of those three legs of the stool are important for the resilience piece. There's a whole related but separate strategy on innovation, but I've talked long enough, so we can come back.
No, Dr. Helper, I think that was great and was a good overview for us on a lot of the issues I think we'll discuss today too. But before we pivot to another question, I want to make sure that Carrie and Tara have an opportunity to weigh in. So either of you, please.
Carrie, go ahead. You start.
Okay, thanks. So I completely agree with Sue, and I think, the themes of resilience and then visibility, traceability, illumination, those are all words that I think for that topic means similar things to folks as they think about supply chains and really getting, below that surface level, that first tier of dependency and understanding, kind of pretty deeply into these various supply chains all the way down to the hole in the ground, really importantly for critical sectors where everything is coming from and from a sourcing standpoint. And then redundancy versus agility, I think that's a really important point as well, Sue. So I appreciate your comments. One thing I would just add to that, and it maybe just goes an inch deeper, is I think focusing and not trying to do everything at once. I think things like Executive Order 14017 provide a very helpful sort of priority list. In terms of, the supply chains that matter most to America, to our strategic stability as a nation in every way, militarily, economically, geopolitically, et cetera, into the future. The one sector, if I were to just, kind of drill into one that I think stands out, and obviously where there's just been a ton of appropriate attention focused both on the congressional side and within the White House and across the administration, and really in various Five Eye and allied partner deliberations and conversations that ties to the strategy piece is microelectronics. And I think, unequivocally, it's the single industry that will have the greatest impact on geopolitics and really the Indo-PACOM region for this foreseeable future. Just some stats to back that up that I just have committed to memory. As of 2022, Taiwan manufactures, as of this year, 41% of the world's high-end logic semiconductors below 22 nanometers. And between the United States and Europe combined, we manufacture 44% of all high-end logic chips, while the PRC manufactures just 2%. But for the 10 nanometer and below, Taiwan manufactures 92%. 92% of the world's most advanced logic chips, which are critical inputs for any, cutting edge technology and the overall evolution of the semiconductor industry. So it's interesting when you unpack that, you really can say neither the PRC, the United States, nor Europe can produce chips smaller than 10 nanometers. So when it comes to strategy, really the United States, Europe, and Europe is obviously a big place, a lot of countries, but mainly Germany, Netherlands, and the UK are really responsible for 94% of the intellectual property required to develop high-end logic chips, while China is responsible for only 4%. So, there are things like that we are obviously focused very heavily on as it relates to Taiwan in particular, and things like, TSMC, which is Taiwan's largest semiconductor company, has agreed to diversify away from Asia and actually build a new fab in Arizona. Obviously, the CHIPS Act, which is still playing out. There's a lot of activity, and certainly within DoD, within the Office of Industrial Policy, there is a lot of appropriate focus on that particular sector and the strategy around it. So I just wanted to call that one out because I do think it stands out in terms of importance, but and just wanted to pull a little bit deeper into one area on the strategic side. And I'll hand it to Tara.
Great. Well, first, let me start, Alexandra, by thanking you and your colleagues at CNAS for this really important report. You know, there's been a lot of talk about supply chains really starting before the pandemic, but obviously COVID hit and the issue blew open. And it's really still, I think, quite unique to see such a thoughtful analytic piece that dives into not just what's happening, but also the policy recommendations moving forward. So thanks so much for having all of us here. Second, I think you're right to start with a call for a strategy. And the report makes a very important point as well, which is supply chain strategies need to be an aspect of the national response from policymakers to this issue. But I would strongly agree that what we really need is an updated industrial policy, period. And policy approaches to working with the industrial base have, I would say, languished in the past several decades. And this issue and what we see happening with supply chains today is a result of many different factors, but one of them is a lack of attention in that area. In terms of what the strategy or a notional supply chain strategy would take on, I won't go into too much detail because I agree with both of my incredibly experienced and very intelligent panelists. And I would just maybe frame it in one way. And it uses a framework that DoD already knows really well and loves, which is the iron triangle. So the iron triangle for supply chain management and supply chain, preventing these challenges, getting our arms around what's happening today is really a challenge among resilience, efficiency, and dominance. And it is those trade-offs that the strategy needs to establish guidance around how to navigate and put down markers for how federal agencies, I would say Department of Defense in particular, can think about the aspects, systems, technologies, areas where resilience is the most important, where risk can be accepted, and the U.S. government will push for that efficiency like we've seen through the era of globalization, as you and the Congresswoman pointed out. And then those supply chains or areas where we simply don't want to accept any risk at all. And that enables us to not only start to put in place targeted approaches for various technologies, products, goods, but it also enables the framework for reshoring as well. If you can push production of these different components to allies and partners, to friends, as your report uses it, in the zones of resilience and efficiency, then in the space that you want to dominate, the United States can own those supply chains end to end. And I think that's an important lesson from the past couple of years. The final point that I would make is any strategy is only as good as execution. And there are 3 specific gaps that the government has today in executing a strategy. You could put the best strategy in place, written by the most brilliant strategists in the world, and none of it will matter if the government doesn't get its arms around the use of data and technology in solving this problem, if it doesn't train its workforce to be able to use that data and technology, and then thirdly, if Congress doesn't fund the mission. None of those 3 things are in place today. They're all tractable problems, but it is the only key to untangling this web. Or I think I would agree with the Congresswoman, it's more of a Gordian knot than a web at this point. That's where I would start.
Yeah, thank you all. Excellent points from all 3 of you. And one thing that I'll note is we agree over at CNAS on that industrial policy point too. Our team actually just put out a report that is focused on thinking about what an industrial policy should look like. That came out within the last month, so you all can find that online as well to see how we're thinking about that. But I do have another question. We have a ton of excellent questions coming in from the audience right now. And one of them I actually wanted to ask you all. So I'm going to pivot off of this one. You all had kind of mentioned how we need to make sure our supply chain is resilient. And one of the things that we do see as recurring issues is when we run into sole source suppliers and we run into barriers when something goes wrong and those disruptions hit the supply chain. So I'm curious to hear from you all. This is specifically on incentives with companies, but what policies do you all think should the US and allied governments put in place to encourage private companies to diversify supply chains that are currently optimized on price? So I only mentioned the sole source as well, because that's, of course, one of the areas we would want to make sure that we're paying attention to as well, that we diversify enough. So Carrie, maybe I will start with you on this question.
Sure, and it's a great question. I will say, just backing up, I love the paper too. I should have said it up front. And I honestly, I go back to the paper so often because every time I'm thinking about a particular issue or sector or just relevant topic comprehensively, I go back to the paper and I realize I'm missing some angle. So it is truly, in my opinion, the most comprehensive supply chain thought piece that is really out there. And I just wanted to thank CNAS for all the work you guys put into that. On the specific question about resilience and minimizing disruptions, a lot of the work that I think I can say both Tara and I do focuses on the defense and aerospace, or the Department of Defense, and then branching into the defense industrial base. I had an opportunity in my former life, circa 2015, 2016, to work on a thought piece called Deliver Uncompromised. And a lot of theme, and it was intended, I was the executive sponsor for that document. And interestingly, on the MITRE side, I knew I'd never get it through the coordination process, frankly, which I know Tara can relate to, and Sue as well. I worked with MITRE to make sure that it saw the light of day. And a lot of recommendations, it was intended to be sort of a call to action for the supply chain risk problem. And I was coming at it at the time from the angle of being the head of counterintelligence for the Department of Defense and working with the FBI and seeing, the incredibly, concerning and problematic trend line as it related to adversarial targeting of the defense industrial base by way of the weak underbelly, which was that sub-tier supplier ecosystem that they frankly knew better than we did. And they would exploit it effectively through multiple threat vectors to get at whatever piece of intellectual property they were targeting and they were after. And the most we were doing on the DoD, or really the government side, was targeting and trying to understand individual threat vectors and shutting them down one by one. But our adversaries had mapped, like I said, our entire ecosystem, and they understood the 5, 6, 7, 8 ways to get after that single piece of IP, which would for them be game changing and allow them to leapfrog ahead of us from a competitive advantage standpoint. So that paper really tried to create, similarly, way back in 2015, 2016, a framework. And one of the key recommendations was, at least that we are now finally seeing progress against, is specific contract language in defense contracts that requires supply chain risk management plan and illumination, visibility, traceability, all the related words, down to a pretty deep level. Third tier, fourth tier is defined differently by every OEM. And then more importantly, the way the defense acquisition enterprise works is cost, schedule, performance. The idea was to really kind of have security as a fourth pillar. I think, that evolved into having that be a foundation as the senior executives in the acquisition sustainment side considered it at the time. But I think what we're seeing now is we are seeing SCRM language actually be written into contracts. So it's happening. And it's actually, for the degree of change and the scale of that change and the significance of it, it's happening pretty quickly. And I think where we're seeing success is when the program offices are making it an allowable cost. And so, from how do you ensure resilience, disruption, incentivize that industry in particular to actually make the investment in the tools. Sue mentioned the tools. Tara and I both like to think we bring a lot of those tools to the fight. You know, you have to understand what's going on in your supply chain. You have to incentivize the market and the industry to invest in those tools. And then you can get after ensuring resilience, minimizing disruption. But if it's not an allowable cost, it's going to continue to be an uphill battle. So again, we're seeing a lot of progress here. And I think, you know, the program offices that are really tip of the spear are making it an allowable cost. And we're seeing the response from the OEMs be very favorable and aggressive in terms of actually getting after the problem, ensuring they have that visibility and that illumination down to the nth tier, and then focusing on how to make those supply chains resilient, diverse, and minimizing disruptions, which ultimately benefits the warfighter. So I'll pause there. That was a long response.
Yeah. No, that was great, Carrie. Tara, Sue, do either of you have anything to add on to that?
I don't think I could top that. I think Carrie put it perfectly and knows the details of both sides well. Although I can't believe you brought up coordination process. I broke into hives, Carrie. I would maybe quibble with one aspect of the question, which is around encouragement. I don't think you can encourage the private sector to do this. I think you have to demand it. And this is where, this is where the power of the data and technology comes into play, right? I mean, just very honestly, the trust but verify mentality applies in this space. The United States government, these program offices have a responsibility to conduct oversight. And that oversight has, really been focused on cost, schedule, and performance, exactly like Carrie said, and reasonably so. Now enter globalization, as the report points out, and a new factor needs to be taken into consideration. But today, government employees, these program offices, are starved of the resources that they need in order to do that verification. And so the dynamic is, and this might tee up other questions from the audience, because the dynamic becomes, well, I can go to the OEM and managing the supply chain is their problem. And you'd go talk to the OEMs and they'll tell you without much embarrassment, because it's such a challenging problem, we don't have a handle on this either. And that's what's beginning to change. And the incentives, like the allowable costs, like funding from Congress, like workforce development, will actually take this nascent effort that's happening in a pretty subscale, fragmented way across a few program offices that are leaders in this space. And it'll scale it to production across the enterprise, just like any other meaningful change will.
Wow, so this is such a rich discussion. And I guess I have several thoughts I'll try to lay out. Maybe to start on resilience versus efficiency. I don't see it as an inevitable trade-off. I see it as something that there are examples of things that actually give you more of both. And additive manufacturing is one of those. Frontline worker problem solving is a second one. And that then I think relates a little bit to this encourage versus demand. Because I think one thing that can help is these are things that, resilience is not something the private sector knows well how to manage or measure. And if you don't, and they don't know how to value it, and they don't know how to invest in it. And so one of the things that's in the America Competes, or the Bipartisan Innovation Act, is something called the Critical Supply Chain Resilience Program. And one of the pieces of that is a center of excellence that would actually build capability, draw on academic consultants, private sector, to do things like value resilience, develop and disseminate tools for that. So that's one thing that we're doing. A second thing that we're doing in collaboration with the private sector is a group called AM Forward, Additive Manufacturing Forward. And this was a number of companies. As it happens, most of them are actually defense contractors. So GE, Lockheed, Siemens Energy, Pratt & Whitney came to us and noted they were having real trouble with lead time. and incapable suppliers. And so we have a partnership now to help them help their suppliers adopt additive manufacturing. And so they're actually investing in this. They've seen the wisdom of that kind of thing. And so then hopefully these investments that are now allowable costs, hopefully they are investments, not kind of ongoing things, but things that will eventually pay off. And then that gets to this diversification sole source thing, which is, I think sole sources are a problem for they're very vulnerable to disruption. That doesn't mean that an infinite number of sources or dozens of sources are better. And the reason here is that actually promotes competition on price. It's very hard to collaborate intensely with 50 suppliers, and so this a highly diverse or many supply chain is often associated, in fact, with a supply chain where competition is based on price. And so I think we need to be very careful about the kinds of rhetoric we use, and it's really important to move away from sole sources and from monopolies. And I think one of the reasons we're seeing kind of one supply chain crisis after another, the latest being infant formula, is that we've allowed incredible monopolies where, in the case of infant formula, four companies control the U.S. market, 90% of the U.S. market. So moving away from that, but also moving away from a system in which big companies have many suppliers that they beat up on price, and these companies are left with no resources to actually innovate, to invest in things like additive manufacturing or the latest technology. So there's research that suggests that in fact small companies are 58% less productive than large companies, and this is one of the reasons. So I think then to this question about getting away from supply chains that are based purely on unit costs, I think it's really important to start measuring some of these hidden costs, the hidden cost of the low price, right? And so measuring resilience, measuring kind of the value of lead time. If a supplier can get you something faster, how much is that worth to you? There are techniques out there managing risk. They're much more complicated, and I think there's a role for government in developing and diffusing these techniques.
Well, absolutely. Well, I wish that we had more time with the three of you. I think I'm going to ask one more quick question because I know we got started a little bit late. Another one that came from the audience that was also similar to something that I was going to ask you all. And I think you have all kind of touched on this in your remarks as well about the need to work with allies and partners. I think we've heard that term friendshoring a lot. There's nearshoring, onshoring, take the terminology that you will. So Dana asks, how do we balance working with our peers, supporting their industrial bases, while ensuring that our own defense industrial base remains prepared? So for as quickly as you're able, I know that's a bit of a big question too, but would love to hear your thoughts. And Tara, maybe I'll start with you this time.
Sure. Well, I think, and this has come up sort of tangentially in a couple of remarks already, there are solid bases for specialization and areas where, especially among established partners and allies, maybe closer in before we start getting few farther rungs out to other countries that we might welcome into that kind of cooperative framework. There are already alliances and foundations for determining what those areas of specialization are. And so and when you think about foreign military sales and you think about the infrastructure already in place for collaboration, particularly across defense programs, it won't help you on baby formula, but at least with some critical technologies and core components, I think that those frameworks or foundations can be leveraged. There's also, we can't talk about this issue without just talking about information sharing, especially given what's happening in the world right now. And, we have seen on the battlefield how important and significant the impact of effective information sharing among allies and partners is. One aspect that, if this session were longer, I'm sure you'd love to get into, Alexandra, I know I would, is the software and cyber side of supply chain security. And so what a prime area to start the friendshoring process than in something like software security, which is already a globalized and federated development process to begin with. Therefore, will absolutely require a global approach to ensuring security, or as global as we can make that network of friends, allies, and partners, and is really quite similar to the foundational information and intelligence sharing that we already have among Five Eyes, among NATO allies, among these wonderful partnerships that our country has built throughout decades. For something like the risk associated with open source code in any technology, civil or defense, that cannot be a neglected part of the overall dialogue, even though it is so wildly different than tampons. And that is a perfect place to say, we know that inputs are coming into the system from everywhere around the world. Let's figure out what all of our different components of putting the solution in place look like too.
I would just pull the thread again an inch deeper. Tara hit on such an important aspect of this, and it's just so, just from a validation standpoint, or providing a tactical example in conversations I've had with both the Australian Defence and the UK Defence embassy folks, and then actual officials from the defense organizations on supply chain. They both independently brought up to me, does the US even understand that some of the things that they're doing to ensure security onshore, and resilience in US supply chains is actually harming us on the allied partner side of the house. So I know we're short on time, and I could unpack that all day. It's fascinating, but I just wanted to put a fine point on the really, really critical aspect of information sharing that Tara brought up, and it ties back to the theme of strategy. But we have to get out of our sort of, our own little myopic view and world, and understand, especially with our Five Eye partners, this has to be a team sport. Because if we're doing things to advantage ourselves, but in the process harming them, it's we're missing the whole point. And so, but it does break down very quickly when you get into the actual work, mapping these critical sectors, technology sectors that are called on EO 14017, for example, and then just being able to share that information. If it's marked CUI, all of a sudden sharing breaks down completely. And then you have to go through a whole bureaucratic process just to share the material with the UKs, the Brits, with the Brits, the Aussies, or the Kiwis. So it really is, it gets into the how, and that's where it really breaks down very quickly. But it's a fundamental aspect of this. Until we get that right, we will not make progress on the information sharing side.
I guess just briefly, I'd say, Carrie, I'd be really interested to hear your examples offline or somehow. And secondly, I think, in principle, there doesn't have to be a trade-off, right? That again, the U.S. I don't think needs to make 100% of everything. We should have that. We're a big country. We should have the knowledge and maybe some capacity to make most things. And so there's a lot of room in there for the U.S. to have an iron and steel industry, but also for Germany, et cetera, to have an iron and steel industry. But as Carrie and Tara have said, the devil's in the details here. Look forward to more discussion, and thanks very much for convening us.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I can't thank you all enough for being here. I really do wish that we could keep going. So we'll have to have you back sometime so we can continue to pull on some of these threads. I know you got me thinking a lot, so I'll be following up with you all. But yes, thank you, Tara, Carrie, Sue, and thank you all for tuning in and for listening in with us. Thank you to Megan for kicking us off and for Representative Houlihan for her remarks. Remember that you can read our report, The Tangled Web We Wove, online at cnas.org. Thank you for sending in your great questions, and I hope that you all have a great rest of your day.